For almost 30 years, the world assumed the story was finished. Courtroom doors shut, judgments were delivered, and the nation moved forward. But Sydney Brooke Simpson never found that closure. She was raised in a home shaped by silence, where truth was never spoken aloud, where staying alive meant pretending you didn't hear anything and denying what your eyes had witnessed. Now, following her father's death, Sydney has finally decided to speak. Not before a judge, not in pursuit of revenge, but to bring an end to a falsehood that has shadowed her since childhood. The night that refused to end. June 12, 1994 did not conclude with sunrise in Los Angeles. For Sydney Brooke Simpson, that night has stretched across 3 decades, replaying in broken sounds, fear, and incomplete memories. She was 8 years old, asleep in her mother Nicole Brown Simpson's Brentwood home, when everything shifted. Later psychological and legal records would reveal that Sydney was not asleep the entire night, as the public long believed. She awoke to sounds that did not belong in a peaceful house. Heavy steps moving through rooms, the noise of a sudden blow, a scream cut short before help could be called, followed by an eerie silence. Police documentation later stated that Sydney and her younger brother Justin were discovered unharmed in an upstairs bedroom. That single line became the basis for a national assumption that the children had seen nothing, heard nothing, and remembered nothing. Yet away from public view, a different reality was taking shape. An emergency intervention report filed by a social worker with Los Angeles County Family Court shortly after the killings documented that Sydney had woken during the incident and was suffering intense distress, confusion, and fear. She was described as withdrawn, overly sensitive to sound, and unwilling to sleep near doors or open areas. Decades later, in a private statement submitted in 2024 to a confidential legal organization, Sydney finally described what she had never been permitted to say publicly. She stated that upon waking that night, she saw a large male figure standing near the doorway that led to the backyard, his hands visibly stained with blood. She did not scream. She did not flee. She became frozen. According to her words, she recognized him immediately. No explanation was needed. School documentation from the 1993 to 1994 academic year confirms a sudden and severe shift in her behavior. She experienced unexplained suspensions, later identified as psychological absences linked to anxiety and trauma. Counselors recorded her fear of loud noises, her refusal to sit close to doors, and repeated panic responses without obvious external cause. A medical evaluation in 1996 formally diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder and recommended years of structured therapy. The violence no one wanted to acknowledge. Long before June 1994, fear had already embedded itself within Nicole Brown Simpson's life. It was neither sudden nor concealed. According to Los Angeles Police Department administrative files, officers responded to Nicole and O.J. Simpson's residence at least 9 times between 1989 and 1994 for domestic disturbance calls. These were not minor disputes or misunderstandings. They were documented incidents involving visible injuries, frantic emergency calls, and repeated pleas for protection that never truly arrived. One of the most troubling incidents occurred on New Year's Eve in 1989. Just before 4 in the morning, Nicole phoned 911 in terror, telling the dispatcher that her husband was going to beat her. When officers arrived, they found her hiding in bushes outside, wearing only a bra and sweatpants. Her lip was split, her eyes swollen, and bruises shaped like fingers were visible around her neck. O.J. Simpson was arrested and later entered a no-contest plea to spousal abuse. His punishment was minimal: community service, counseling, and a modest fine. Publicly, the matter appeared resolved. For Nicole, nothing changed. Friends later confirmed that following the arrest, the abuse did not end. It evolved. Nicole became increasingly isolated, more guarded, and deeply fearful of what could happen if she tried to leave permanently. In custody documents submitted in 1993, she described O.J.'s behavior toward both her and the children as unstable and emotionally dangerous. The court granted her primary custody, initially limiting his visitation rights. These were not hypothetical fears. They were legal warnings. As Sydney grew older, she slowly began to understand that what she had experienced as fear and confusion had context. In private accounts shared after her father's death, she described learning that her mother lived under constant observation. After Nicole separated from OJ, he allegedly hired private investigators to follow her movements, photographed men she interacted with, and placed tracking devices on her vehicle. Sydney later stated that her mother lived with the feeling of being watched at all times, even after the divorce was finalized. What he said when no one else could hear. For years, Sydney Brooke Simpson avoided discussions about her father. Not because she denied reality, but because it was a form of survival. Publicly, O.J. Simpson maintained the same stance he had taken since the verdict, calm, defiant, insisting the matter was settled. Privately, according to Sydney, his tone was very different. Those private moments, far removed from cameras and courtrooms, planted the seeds of her eventual decision. After the trial, Sydney and her brother were aggressively shielded from media exposure. Guardians, attorneys, and relatives agreed on one principle: silence equaled safety. But as Sydney entered her teenage years, questions could no longer be avoided. She began asking about her mother, about the night she died, and about why so many people believed something terrible had occurred despite her father's acquittal. Documents released after 2024 show that O.J.'s responses were never straightforward. He neither confessed nor denied. Instead, he spoke in fragments, carefully chosen phrases that avoided clarity while leaving room for interpretation. In one privately recorded conversation later summarized in legal notes, Sydney recalled her father saying that things spiraled out of control that night, that mistakes were made, and that anger can turn a moment into something irreversible. He never named anyone. He never described actions. But he also never expressed shock over what happened. For Sydney, that lack of disbelief mattered more than the words themselves. The turning point arrived years later during an in-person meeting in Florida in 2019. By then, Sydney was an adult who had built a life deliberately separate from the Simpson name. During that meeting, O.J. handed her a copy of If I Did It and told her, "You should read this. You'll understand me better." According to Sydney's written account, the gesture felt intentional, not defensive, not explanatory, but confessional without being spoken. She later wrote that it felt as though he was asking her to carry a burden he no longer wanted to hold alone. She did read the book, and it did not provide clarity. Provided confirmation. The detailed language, the hypothetical framing, and the emotional tone convinced her that what was presented as fiction was instead distance, a way to approach truth without directly stating it. After that meeting, Sydney ended all contact. No calls, no visits, no messages. She later explained that this decision was not sudden, but a boundary she had been preparing to establish for years. In a private letter sent that same year to the Goldman family's legal representatives, she wrote that she did not seek apologies or reconciliation. She sought acknowledgement even if it never came publicly. When O.J.'s health deteriorated in late 2023, Sydney made one final visit. It lasted less than an hour. According to a transcript from a caregiver present, she told him she had not come to forgive him. She had come to ensure he knew she remembered. Witnesses later stated that O.J. was largely unresponsive, though he cried quietly. As she left, Sydney spoke words that defined her future. She no longer considered herself his daughter, and she would refuse any inheritance. When O.J. Simpson died on April 10, 2024, the public response was divided, as it had always been. Some mourned a fallen sports figure. Others spoke openly about violence, injustice, and a verdict that never brought peace. For Sydney Brooke Simpson, his death did not reopen wounds. It closed something unfinished. Weeks later, probate filings revealed that O.J. Simpson's estate was valued at approximately $3 million, derived from protected pensions, residual endorsements, and investments that survived years of litigation. His remains were cremated, and portions of his ashes were made into jewelry for his children. To many, this appeared symbolic. To Sydney, it meant something else. In May 2024, a legally authenticated disclaimer was submitted to the probate court. In it, Sydney formally rejected all claims to her father's estate, including undisclosed joint investments and long-standing trusts created years earlier. The document was unemotional, exact, permanent. In an accompanying statement released through her attorneys, Sidney summarized her position in one sentence. She could not accept anything tied to her mother's blood. This was not an impulsive act. Records show that Sidney had begun disentangling herself from her father's financial structures months before his death. Trust withdrawal filings from early 2024 confirm she requested and received removal from all future wealth transfer mechanisms. Banking institutions later confirmed that assets that could have passed to her remained undistributed under beneficiary disclaimer provisions. For Sidney, legality mattered less than responsibility. In a private document later referenced during estate proceedings, she wrote that accepting inheritance would mean participating in a system that had protected the wrong person for far too long. She did not want symbolic closure. She wanted moral distance, a life defined by quiet. After everything she endured, Sidney Brooks Simpson did not vanish. She rebuilt carefully, intentionally, far from the noise that defined her childhood. While the public speculated endlessly about what she knew or believed, Sidney focused on learning how to live without fear. Court and medical records confirm that she remained in long-term psychological treatment through adolescence and adulthood. A clinical assessment in the mid-1990s confirmed post-traumatic stress disorder marked by sleep disruption, sound-triggered anxiety, and persistent hypervigilance. Therapy was never about erasing memory. It was about control, learning how to function in a world that never felt safe. By the early 2000s, follow-up evaluations noted measurable improvement but also observed that silence had become her primary coping strategy. In 2000, Sidney and her brother Justin relocated to Florida. The move was deliberate. Distance from Los Angeles meant distance from cameras, speculation, and a past that followed her everywhere. She enrolled at Boston University, studying sociology with a focus on crime, media exposure, and the long-term psychological impact on children linked to public violence. Academic records show she completed her degree on schedule and avoided any public association with her family's history. Her thesis never mentioned her parents by name. After graduating, Sidney briefly worked with a nonprofit supporting young people affected by domestic violence. Former supervisors later described her as reserved but deeply empathetic, especially toward children who struggled to express fear. Despite her effectiveness, she left after just over a year, recognizing that constant exposure to similar trauma was emotionally unsustainable. What followed was a shift, not withdrawal. By the mid-2000s, Sidney entered the Florida real estate market. Public business filings show she co-founded limited liability companies focused on residential renovation and property management. By 2017, she became majority shareholder and chief executive of a growing investment firm operating across the Tampa Bay and St. Petersburg regions. Audited financial records later confirmed steady growth, conservative risk management, and strict separation between her professional identity and her family name. Throughout this time, Sidney rejected every request for interviews, documentaries, or public commentary related to the case. Legal correspondence confirms that at least 16 formal media requests were declined in writing. Her reasoning never changed. Publicly revisiting the past risked undoing decades of psychological recovery. She married privately, built a family, and structured her legal and financial life around privacy and independence. All administrative records reflected the same intention: to live as a person, not a symbol. No legacy speeches. No public reckoning, just distance. A truth that did not require a verdict. When Sidney Brooks Simpson finally spoke after her father's death, she did not frame her words as accusation. She did not seek justice from a court that had closed its doors long ago. What she offered instead